Normandy coast, June 6, 1944, 0600 hours, and Obergefreiter Wilhelm Krause gripped the handles of his MG-42 machine gun inside the concrete casemate designated Widerstandsnest 73, watching the gray waters of the English Channel through the narrow embrasure as the largest invasion fleet in human history materialized from the morning mist, completely unaware that British engineers had developed a weapon specifically designed to delete fortifications like his in a single catastrophic shot, a 40-pound demolition charge that would make 2 meters of reinforced concrete as useful as cardboard against the specialized Churchill tanks already loading into landing craft. The MG-42, that beautiful instrument of destruction they called Hitler's buzzsaw, could spit out 1,200 rounds per minute, creating interlocking fields of fire with the other positions along the Atlantic Wall that Field Marshal Rommel had spent months perfecting. Yet Krause had no idea that the British 79th Armoured Division had been training for over a year with modified Churchill tanks mounting 29mm spigot mortars that could lob what they nicknamed the flying dustbin directly through his firing slit from 80 yards away. The German defensive doctrine built everything around the MG-42, with each 10-man squad essentially serving the needs of that single weapon, carrying ammunition, spare barrels that needed changing every 250 rounds when the gun overheated, and protecting the gunner who controlled the battlefield with sustained bursts of 7.92mm rounds that could cut down entire platoons in seconds. 3 months earlier, in March 1944, Krause had watched the Todt organization labor crews, mostly conscripted French workers and Italian prisoners, pour thousands of cubic meters of concrete to reinforce his position, creating walls 3.5 meters thick on the seaward side, designed to withstand naval bombardment and direct tank fire, with the embrasure carefully angled to provide enfilade fire along the beach while presenting minimal target to attacking forces. The position at WN-73 near Le Hamel had been designated a priority strongpoint, receiving one of the few 75mm anti-tank guns available, backed by multiple MG-42 nests in reinforced Tobruk positions, those small concrete bunkers for single soldiers that dotted the coastline like mushrooms, each one carefully sited to cover dead zones and create overlapping kill zones that would channel attacking infantry into predetermined fields of fire. The German commanders had studied the failed Allied raid at Dieppe in August 1942, where Canadian Churchill tanks had been stopped cold on the beach, unable to penetrate the defensive positions or climb the seawall, and they believed their improved fortifications made any similar assault suicidal, not knowing that Lieutenant J.J. Denevan of the Royal Canadian Engineers had been working since that disaster to develop a Churchill variant that could survive approaching these positions and deliver a knockout blow. The development had been assigned to Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armoured Division, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies for their strange-looking specialized tanks, and by June 1944 they had produced 180 Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers, or AVREs, each one carrying multiple 40-pound demolition charges that could turn a concrete bunker into rubble with a single hit. At Widerstandsnest 62, 5 kilometers to the east, 20-year-old Heinrich Severloh had been manning his MG-42 since before dawn, the son of a farmer who had never fired a shot in anger before this morning, positioned with Lieutenant Bernhard Firking in an observation post that commanded the entire eastern section of what the Allies called Omaha Beach, though Severloh's sector would actually face British forces advancing from Gold Beach. The 352nd Infantry Division had been moved to the coast only weeks before, and while they were considered veteran troops, having fought on the Eastern Front, they had never encountered anything like the specialized armor that was about to assault their positions, weapons designed specifically to neutralize the advantages of fortified machine gun nests that had dominated battlefield tactics since the Somme. The MG-42's psychological impact on Allied soldiers was profound, its distinctive high-pitched ripping sound, like tearing canvas, causing veteran troops to freeze in terror. But the Germans manning these weapons had their own fears, particularly the dreaded flamethrower tanks they had encountered in Russia, though nothing in their experience had prepared them for a weapon that could deliver 40 pounds of high explosive directly through their carefully designed firing slits. The mathematics of the MG-42 were simple and terrifying. With a practical rate of fire around 150 rounds per minute in sustained bursts to prevent overheating, a single gun could theoretically put 32 rounds into every square foot of beach every 10 seconds, creating the kind of concentrated firepower that had stopped the Canadians cold at Dieppe. Yet all that firepower became irrelevant when facing a tank that could approach under covering fire and delete the entire position with one shot. In Italy, along the Gothic line that stretched across the Apennines, Unteroffizier Bruno Hoffmann of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had been holding similar positions since the fall of 1943, his MG-42 controlling a narrow pass near Monte Battaglia, where the terrain funneled Allied forces into kill zones that turned every meter of advance into a bloodbath, though even here in the mountains, British forces had begun deploying specialized armor that could survive the withering fire long enough to deliver demolition charges that made fortifications obsolete. The German paratroopers, elite troops who had been converted to ground forces after the Pyrrhic victory at Crete, had become masters of defensive warfare, positioning their MG-42s to achieve maximum psychological impact, forcing Allied troops to advance through interlocking fields of fire that turned hillsides into killing fields, yet they too would soon learn that concrete and earthworks offered no protection against the flying dustbin. Meanwhile, halfway around the world on Okinawa, Japanese forces had studied German defensive tactics and created even more elaborate fortifications, with Colonel Yahara Hiramichi designing a defense in depth that incorporated natural caves expanded into underground fortresses, each one housing Type 92 heavy machine guns, the Japanese equivalent of the MG-42, positioned to cover the approaches with interlocking fire while remaining invisible until American forces were fully committed to the kill zone. The Japanese had learned from German reports about Allied armor capabilities, but they believed their deeper positions, some carved 30 feet into solid rock, would prove impervious to any demolition charge, not yet understanding that American forces had developed their own specialized weapons, including Sherman tanks modified with Navy Mark I flamethrowers that could project napalm gasoline mixture 200 yards into cave mouths. Back at Luhamel, as the morning of June 6 progressed, Krause could hear the naval bombardment intensifying, shells from British cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Argonaut screaming overhead, most of them impacting behind his position, failing to penetrate the thick concrete that protected his MG-42, giving him false confidence that the Atlantic Wall would hold as Rommel had promised, though he noticed with growing concern that the preliminary bombardment seemed lighter than expected, almost as if the Allies were preserving the beach defenses for capture rather than destruction. The gun crew beside him, Gefreiter Müller operating the loader position and Schütze Wagner managing the ammunition supply, had been trained to change the hot barrel in less than 20 seconds, a critical skill when the MG-42's tendency to overheat could create fatal gaps in their defensive fire, though neither man suspected that their position's lifespan would be measured in hours, not days. At 7:25 hours, the first wave of British troops from the 50th Infantry Division began landing at Gold Beach, and Krause opened fire with his MG-42, the weapon performing exactly as designed, cutting down soldiers of the 1st Hampshire Regiment as they struggled through the surf, each burst carefully controlled to prevent jamming, 7 to 10 rounds at a time, the barrel already beginning to heat up as he swept the beach with methodical precision, completely focused on his sector of fire and unaware of the specialized tanks being unloaded just beyond his field of view. The British had learned from Dieppe that standard tanks were vulnerable on the beach, so the Churchill AVREs assigned to support the Gold Beach assault had been given additional armor plating on their frontal arc, some reports claiming they could withstand direct hits from the dreaded 88mm anti-tank guns, though their rail protection came from their ability to suppress defensive positions with covering fire while approaching to point-blank range. Unteroffizier Henrik Knaub of the 325th Infantry Division, positioned in a reserve bunker behind the main defensive line, had been trained to identify Allied tank types from recognition cards, but when he saw the first Churchill AVREs moving up from the beach, he was baffled by their stubby, wide-bore guns that looked nothing like the 75mm Shermans or standard Churchills in his identification materials, weapons so short and thick they seemed almost comical, like a child's toy compared to the long-barreled anti-tank guns the Germans favored. The petard mortar mounted on the AVREs had been specifically designed by Colonel Blacker, who had previously developed the Blacker Bombard for the Home Guard, creating a spigot mortar system where a massive spring absorbed 20 tons of recoil energy and used it to recock the weapon, allowing it to fire 40-pound demolition charges accurately enough to put them through a bunker embrasure at 80 yards. The British assault engineers of the 79th Armoured Division had trained exhaustively at the Assault Training School in Suffolk, where they had constructed replica German bunkers to practice their approach tactics, learning to coordinate with infantry and standard tanks to suppress defensive positions while the AVREs moved into firing position, a deadly choreography that turned the Germans' own defensive doctrine against them by using the predictable fields of fire to plan covered approaches. Each AVRE carried a crew of 6, including 5 Royal Engineers and 1 Royal Armoured Corps driver, with a dedicated demolition NCO responsible for preparing the charges, though the most dangerous job fell to the co-driver, who had to expose his hands and arms to reload the petard mortar through a sliding hatch, breaking the weapon open like a giant shotgun to insert the next 40-pound round while machine gun fire sparked off the tank's armor. At Widerstandsnest 36, nearest Nels, Feldwebel Otto Richter, commanding another MG-42 position, had just reported to his battalion headquarters that his weapon had fired over 3,000 rounds in the first hour of the invasion, burning through 3 spare barrels, the concrete floor of his bunker littered with spent brass casings that clinked and rolled underfoot as his crew maneuvered to feed fresh ammunition belts into the insatiable weapon, when he noticed a Churchill tank approaching his position, with what appeared to be a bundle of logs mounted on its front. The Fascine carrier was another AVRE variant, designed to drop bundles of wood and brushwood into anti-tank ditches to create crossings, but Richter didn't know that these same tanks carried the dreaded petard mortar, and his first indication that something was terribly wrong came when the tank stopped 80 yards from his position and its stubby gun elevated toward his embrasure. Major Peter Sellery of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, supporting the British 8th Armoured Brigade's advance inland from Gold Beach, later described watching an AVRE engage a German strongpoint. "I ordered the Churchill AVRE forward to demolish the house with the petard, and something like a small flying dustbin hit the house just above the front door, collapsing it like a pack of cards, spilling the defenders with their machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and an avalanche of bricks into the courtyard." A clinical description that failed to capture the sheer terror experienced by the German defenders who saw these weapons in action. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating, as word spread along the defensive line that the British had a weapon that could knock out reinforced concrete positions with a single shot, causing some MG-42 crews to abandon their posts rather than face certain death when an AVRE approached their position. The flying dustbin itself was officially designated the No. 1 demolition bomb, a 636 mm long projectile with a diameter of 230 mm, filled with 40 pounds of high explosive that could penetrate 2 meters of reinforced concrete or, more commonly, enter through the embrasure and detonate inside the bunker with catastrophic results, turning the confined space into a death trap as the blast wave reflected off the concrete walls, multiplying its lethal effect. The Germans had encountered demolition charges before, particularly the satchel charges used by combat engineers, but those required soldiers to approach on foot under fire and manually place the explosives, a near-suicidal task against an active MG-42 position, while the AVRE could deliver the same destructive power from relative safety, protected by armor that could withstand everything except a direct hit from an 88 mm gun. By 8 o'clock hours on D-Day, the first AVREs were in action along the British and Canadian beaches, with the 5th Assault Regiment Royal Engineers supporting the 50th Division at Gold Beach, the 6th Assault Regiment with the 3rd Canadian Division at Juno Beach, and the 42nd Assault Regiment operating with the 3rd British Division at Sword Beach, each regiment fielding dozens of specialized Churchill tanks that systematically eliminated German strongpoints that had been considered impregnable. The 26th Assault Squadron alone, supporting the Canadian advance at Juno Beach, destroyed 6 major concrete bunkers in the first 3 hours of the invasion, including the notorious 1 Charlie AVRE commanded by Lieutenant Bill Dunn, which cleared a vital exit from the beach before becoming stuck in a shell crater and having to be abandoned, though not before its crew had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the petard mortar against German fortifications. At Luhamel, where Krause's MG-42 had been decimating British troops for hours, creating a bottleneck that threatened to stall the entire advance on the western flank of Gold Beach, Company C of the 1st Hampshires had been pinned down since 7:30, taking horrific casualties as they tried to flank the position, with Major Warren, assuming command after Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Smith was wounded, finally deciding they would have to circle around and attack from the rear, a maneuver that would take precious hours under constant fire. The German position at Luhamel was particularly formidable, with its 75 mm gun casemate facing east to provide enfilade fire along the beach, protected by a 3.5 meter thick concrete wall on the seaward side, while multiple MG-42 positions in surrounding buildings created interlocking fields of fire that made any approach seemingly impossible, turning the area into what one British soldier called a complete killing ground where nothing could survive. At 1500 hours, an AVRE from 82nd Assault Squadron, Royal Engineers, finally managed to work its way into position, approaching under covering fire from Sherman tanks of the Westminster Dragoons, the driver navigating through the rubble and craters while the commander directed supporting infantry to suppress the German positions with small arms fire, creating just enough distraction for the massive Churchill to lumber into range. The tank commander, Sergeant James Patterson, a coal miner from Durham who had volunteered for the Royal Engineers, carefully positioned his vehicle 75 yards from the main bunker, traversing the turret until the stubby petard mortar was aligned with the embrasure where Krause's MG-42 had been spitting death for 8 hours straight. The German gunner still firing desperate bursts at the approaching infantry, unaware that his position had seconds to live. The first petard round struck the concrete just above the embrasure with a thunderous explosion that shook the entire structure. Chunks of reinforced concrete flying like shrapnel, the blast wave stunning everyone inside even though the bunker hadn't been penetrated. But Patterson's loader, sapper Tommy Clark, was already breaking open the mortar to insert another flying dustbin. His hands working with practiced efficiency despite the machine gun fire crackling off the tank's armor. The second round flew true, entering directly through the embrasure and detonating inside the bunker with apocalyptic force. The 40 pounds of high explosive compressed into the confined space, creating overpressure that ruptured eardrums and collapsed lungs, while the concrete walls that had been their protection became an echo chamber that amplified the destruction, killing Krause and his entire crew instantly. At 1600 hours, the same AVRE fired a third petard round into the rear entrance of the Lou Hamel Strongpoint's main casemate, finally silencing the 75mm gun that had been wreaking havoc on the beach all day. The explosion so powerful that German soldiers in surrounding positions abandoned their weapons and fled into the village, where they would be hunted down in house-to-house fighting that continued until nightfall, though the destruction of the main bunker had effectively broken the backbone of the defense. The psychological impact rippled along the entire German line as survivors spread word that the British had tanks that could destroy any bunker with a single shot, causing panic among MG-42 crews who realized their concrete fortifications, which they had been told would protect them from anything the Allies could throw at them, were now death traps. In Italy, German forces along the Gothic line received reports of the Normandy landings with growing alarm, particularly the accounts of specialized British tanks that could neutralize fortified positions, prompting General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring to request urgent intelligence on these new weapons, though by then it was too late to develop countermeasures, and German engineers could only recommend dispersing defensive positions and avoiding concentrated strongpoints that could be eliminated with a single lucky hit. The Italian RSI forces, fighting alongside the Germans, were even more demoralized by these reports, having already witnessed the effectiveness of Allied specialized armor during the breakthrough at Cassino, where Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks had burned out defensive positions that had held for months, combining with AVREs in a terrifying combination the troops called blowtorch and corkscrew. On Okinawa, Japanese forces studying German defensive tactics through their military attaché in Berlin had initially dismissed reports of Allied bunker-busting tanks as propaganda, believing their deeper cave fortifications carved into solid rock would prove impervious to any demolition charge. But by April 1945 they would face their own nightmare as American Sherman tanks modified with flamethrowers by Navy Seabees systematically burned out their positions, the napalm gasoline mixture flowing like liquid death through tunnel systems, consuming oxygen and creating temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The Japanese had positioned their Type 92 and Type 96 machine guns, with rates of fire approaching 500 rounds per minute, in carefully concealed cave mouths that commanded approaches to key terrain features, creating kill zones that forced American infantry to call for specialized armor support, leading to the deployment of the 713th Tank Battalion, which had been entirely converted to flamethrower tanks at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. Colonel Yahara's defensive plan for Okinawa had incorporated lessons learned from German experiences in Europe, creating multiple defensive lines with mutually supporting positions that could continue fighting even if individual strongpoints were knocked out. But he hadn't anticipated the psychological impact of flamethrower tanks on his troops, many of whom chose suicide rather than being burned alive when the Shermans approached their positions. The American tanks, designated CWS-POA-H4 by the Chemical Warfare Service, Pacific Ocean Area, Hawaii, could project flame accurately to 200 yards, but more terrifyingly, they could fire wet shots of unignited fuel that would seep into cave systems before being ignited, creating firestorms that consumed everything inside, a tactic that caused even veteran Japanese troops to abandon positions they had sworn to defend to the death. Back in Normandy, as the afternoon of D-Day progressed, German commanders were receiving increasingly desperate reports from frontline positions about British tanks with short, wide guns that were systematically destroying bunkers that had taken months to construct, with General Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, personally witnessing an AVRE destroy a Tobruk position with a single shot, the small concrete bunker simply disappearing in a cloud of dust and debris. The general had immediately contacted Rommel's headquarters to report this new threat, but the Field Marshal was still in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, having been assured by weather forecasters that the conditions were too poor for an invasion, leaving the German response fragmented and uncoordinated as individual commanders tried to adapt to a weapon they didn't understand. The MG-42 crews who survived the initial assault were pulled back to secondary positions, but these hastily prepared fieldworks offered even less protection against the AVREs, which could simply drive up and fire their petard mortars at point-blank range, the massive demolition charges turning machine gun nests into craters, often killing entire squads with a single shot as the blast wave propagated through trench systems. German doctrine had emphasized the MG-42 as the centerpiece of infantry tactics, with riflemen essentially serving as ammunition carriers and barrel changers for the machine gun, but this concentration of firepower in a single weapon system became a vulnerability when facing an enemy that could eliminate that weapon with one well-placed demolition charge. At Widerstandsnest 62, where Heinrich Severloh had been firing his MG-42 for 9 continuous hours, claiming later to have fired 12,000 rounds and inflicted over 1,000 casualties, though these numbers were likely exaggerated by the fog of war and trauma. American forces from the 16th Infantry Regiment finally breached the position at 8:25, not with specialized armor but through sheer weight of numbers and determination, though Severloh himself survived by abandoning his position when ammunition ran out. His account, published decades later, would become controversial for its claims of single-handedly stopping the American advance. But what's undeniable is that the MG-42 positions at WN-62 and other strongpoints along Omaha Beach held out longer than those facing British forces, precisely because the Americans had rejected the use of Hobart's funnies, including the AVREs that were proving so effective against similar positions. General Omar Bradley's decision to decline most of the specialized armor offered by the British, accepting only the DD amphibious tanks while rejecting the AVREs, crocodiles, and other funnies, would be criticized by historians as contributing to the near disaster at Omaha Beach, where American forces suffered over 2,000 casualties in the first day, many of them to MG-42 positions that could have been eliminated quickly with petard mortars. The American approach relied on conventional combined arms tactics, with infantry, artillery, and standard tanks working together to suppress and destroy enemy positions, but this meant accepting much higher casualties as soldiers had to assault positions that the British were simply deleting with 40-pound demolition charges. The German High Command's response to the AVRE threat was hampered by their rigid command structure and the disruption of communications by Allied air superiority and French resistance sabotage, with many units not receiving warning about these specialized tanks until they were already under attack, leading to confusion and panic as weapons that had been considered invulnerable suddenly became death traps. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, would later write that the appearance of specialized armor capable of defeating concrete fortifications invalidated our entire defensive strategy. Though he also noted that even if they had known about these weapons earlier, Germany lacked the resources to develop countermeasures or modify their defenses. By nightfall on June 6, the British 50th Infantry Division had advanced nearly 10 kilometers inland from Gold Beach, having destroyed or captured dozens of German strongpoints with the help of AVREs and other specialized armor, while at Omaha Beach, American forces had barely secured a foothold after suffering catastrophic casualties assaulting positions that could have been eliminated with a single petard round. The contrast was not lost on American commanders, and within weeks, United States forces were requesting British AVRE support for operations against German fortifications, though the limited number of these specialized vehicles meant they remained primarily with Commonwealth forces throughout the campaign. The psychological impact of the flying dustbin extended far beyond its actual destructive capability, as German soldiers who had never even seen an AVRE began abandoning fortified positions at the mere rumor of approaching British tanks, creating a cascade effect that undermined the entire Atlantic Wall concept, which had been predicated on the assumption that concrete fortifications could hold long enough for mobile reserves to counterattack. The MG-42, which had been the cornerstone of German defensive doctrine since 1942, suddenly seemed obsolete when facing an enemy that could eliminate the gun and its entire crew with a single shot from beyond the weapon's effective range, forcing a fundamental reconsideration of defensive tactics. In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied forces pushed inland through the Norman bocage country, AVREs continued to prove their worth against German strongpoints, though the close terrain often limited their effectiveness, and many were lost to Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets fired from concealed positions, the Germans having learned that the AVRE's thick frontal armor didn't extend to their sides and rear. The 79th Armored Division's war diary records that by the end of June 1944, AVREs had destroyed over 400 German bunkers, pillboxes, and reinforced buildings, with each successful engagement saving potentially dozens of Allied lives that would have been lost in conventional assaults. German efforts to counter the AVRE threat included orders to site MG-42 positions in depth rather than concentrated strongpoints, dispersing firepower to prevent a single demolition charge from eliminating multiple weapons, but this dilution of defensive strength made positions more vulnerable to conventional infantry assault, creating a tactical dilemma with no good solution. Some commanders attempted to use captured French tanks as mobile pillboxes, burying them turret deep to create hardened firing positions that could be quickly relocated, but these improvised fortifications proved even more vulnerable to petard mortars, which could penetrate the thinner armor and detonate inside the confined space with lethal results. The Italian theater saw similar adaptations, with German forces along the Gothic line abandoning elaborate concrete fortifications in favor of dispersed positions using natural terrain features, though this made them more vulnerable to the aggressive patrolling tactics favored by British and Indian troops, who could infiltrate between positions under cover of darkness and attack from unexpected directions. The Italian RSI forces, already demoralized by the fall of Rome and the obvious futility of their cause, were particularly affected by reports of Allied wonder weapons, with entire battalions surrendering rather than face the combination of AVREs and Churchill crocodile flamethrowers that had become known as I Mos Tri Britannici, the British monsters. On the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was simultaneously fighting a desperate defensive battle against the Red Army's summer offensive, Operation Bag Ration, German commanders noted with alarm that Soviet forces were beginning to deploy similar specialized armor, including T-34 tanks modified with mine rollers and KV tanks converted to flamethrowers, suggesting that the Allies were sharing technology and tactics. The nightmare scenario of facing bunker-busting tanks on multiple fronts became reality by the autumn of 1944, stretching German defensive capabilities beyond the breaking point and contributing to the accelerating collapse of the Third Reich. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Nishitakichi, frantically telegraphed reports about Allied specialized armor to Tokyo, warning that traditional defensive tactics based on fortified positions and machine gun strongpoints were obsolete, recommending instead a defense based on mobility and concealment, though by then Japanese forces were already committed to static defenses on Iwo Jima and Okinawa that would prove catastrophically vulnerable to American flamethrower tanks. The Japanese had spent years studying German defensive successes on the Eastern Front, where MG-42 positions had inflicted massive casualties on Soviet human wave attacks, but they failed to appreciate that the Allies had developed specific countermeasures that made such tactics suicidal. At Okinawa, the Japanese 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru had created the most elaborate defensive system in the Pacific, with over 60 miles of tunnel connecting positions carved deep into the limestone bedrock, each one carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire while remaining invisible until American forces were fully committed to the kill zone, a defensive masterpiece that should have been impregnable. Yet when the American 713th Tank Battalion arrived with 54 Sherman tanks converted to flamethrowers, these positions became crematoriums, the flames flowing through tunnel systems like water, following every passage and air shaft, turning elaborate defensive networks into death traps that consumed entire companies in walls of fire. The German observation of these Pacific battles, transmitted through their embassy in Tokyo before Japan's surrender, confirmed their worst fears about the obsolescence of static defense, with one report noting that the Americans have perfected what the British began at Normandy, the systematic elimination of fortified positions through specialized armor that makes traditional defensive concepts worthless, a bitter acknowledgement of tactical failure. The MG-42, which had been the pride of German infantry weapons, capable of dominating battlefields from North Africa to the Arctic Circle, had been reduced to irrelevance by a simple spigot mortar firing what looked like a flying dustbin, a humiliating end for what many considered the finest machine gun ever made. In the final analysis, the AVRE's impact on World War II went far beyond the actual bunkers it destroyed or the casualties it inflicted, fundamentally changing how military planners thought about fortifications and defensive warfare, proving that no position, no matter how well constructed or heavily armed, was invulnerable to specialized assault weapons designed specifically to counter it. The German reliance on the MG-42 as the cornerstone of their defensive doctrine had created a critical vulnerability, concentrating firepower in fixed positions that became priority targets for Allied specialized armor, turning their greatest strength into a fatal weakness that contributed significantly to their defeat. The lessons learned from the employment of AVREs at Normandy influenced military doctrine for decades, with every major army developing specialized engineering vehicles capable of defeating fortifications, from the Soviet IMR series to the American M728 combat engineer vehicle, all tracing their lineage back to the Churchill tanks that deleted German MG-42 nests with flying dustbins. Modern military forces still study the Normandy campaign as a masterclass in specialized warfare, where technological innovation and tactical adaptation overcame seemingly insurmountable defensive positions, though the human cost of these lessons, paid in blood on beaches from France to the Pacific, should never be forgotten. Veterans of the German 352nd Infantry Division, interviewed decades after the war, consistently identified the appearance of AVREs as the moment they knew the Atlantic Wall had failed, with one survivor stating, "We had been told our concrete bunkers could withstand anything, that our MG-42s would cut down the British and Americans like wheat, but then came these tanks with their strange short guns, and suddenly concrete meant nothing. Our positions exploded like they were made of paper, and we knew the war was lost." This psychological impact, the shattering of confidence in defensive preparations that had taken years to construct, may have been the AVRE's greatest contribution to Allied victory, breaking not just bunkers but the will to resist. The Italian soldiers of the RSI, fighting alongside Germans in the Gothic Line, had an even more visceral reaction to Allied specialized armor, with many units simply melting away rather than face the Churchill tanks they called I distruttori. The destroyers, abandoning positions that had taken months to construct after witnessing a single AVRE demolish a reinforced strongpoint. Their accounts, preserved in Italian military archives, describe the complete demoralization that followed the realization that no fortification could protect them, that death could come at any moment from a weapon they couldn't fight back against, leading to mass surrenders that accelerated the collapse of Axis forces in Italy. Japanese forces on Okinawa, despite their cultural emphasis on death before dishonor, showed similar psychological breakdown when facing American flamethrower tanks, with numerous accounts of soldiers abandoning positions against direct orders rather than be burned alive, a previously unthinkable breach of Bushido that demonstrated the sheer terror these weapons inspired. The American Chemical Warfare Service reported that the mere appearance of flamethrower tanks often caused immediate surrender or flight, with one officer noting that the psychological effect was worth 10 times the actual casualties inflicted. Entire defensive sectors would collapse at the rumor of approaching flame tanks. The technical evolution from the MG-42's dominance to its obsolescence in the face of specialized armor represents a microcosm of World War II's broader technological race, where each side's innovations prompted counter-innovations in an accelerating spiral that ultimately favored the Allies' industrial capacity to develop and deploy specialized solutions. The German MG-42, with its revolutionary roller-locked mechanism and unprecedented rate of fire, had seemed like the ultimate infantry weapon when introduced in 1942, capable of single-handedly controlling vast stretches of battlefield. Yet by 1944 it had been neutralized by a weapon that looked almost medieval in its simplicity, a spring-powered spigot mortar. The British 79th Armoured Division's after-action reports from Normandy documented 342 major fortifications destroyed by AVREs in the first month of operations, with each success typically representing dozens or hundreds of Allied lives saved. A grim calculus that justified the resources invested in developing these specialized vehicles, even as German commanders desperately tried to adapt their tactics. The division's commander, Major General Percy Hobart, whose unconventional thinking had initially made him unpopular with the British military establishment, was vindicated by the success of his funnies, though he always maintained that the true credit belonged to the crews who took these unusual vehicles into combat. Individual AVRE crews became legends within their units, like Sergeant Bill Hawkins of the 26th Assault Squadron, who destroyed 7 German bunkers on D-Day before his Churchill was knocked out by an 88mm anti-tank gun, or Lieutenant James Morrison of the 82nd Assault Squadron, who used his AVRE to demolish the main strongpoint at Hillman, a massive complex that had survived hours of naval bombardment. These men, mostly Royal Engineers who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the invasion, understood that their survival depended on speed and aggression, getting close enough to use their petard mortars before German anti-tank weapons could respond, a deadly game of seconds where hesitation meant death. The German defensive doctrine, refined through years of combat on the Eastern Front where MG-42 positions had massacred Soviet infantry in their thousands, proved catastrophically inadequate against an enemy that had developed specific countermeasures, demonstrating the danger of preparing to fight the last war rather than anticipating future innovations. The Atlantic Wall, which had consumed massive resources and propaganda value as Hitler's impregnable fortress, crumbled in a single day when faced with weapons it hadn't been designed to resist, proving that fixed fortifications, no matter how elaborate, were obsolete in modern warfare. The post-war analysis by the German General Staff, conducted while many officers were in Allied captivity, identified the failure to anticipate and counter specialized assault vehicles as one of the critical factors in their defeat, noting that the British Churchill AVREs and similar vehicles invalidated years of defensive preparation in a matter of hours, turning our strongest positions into death traps. This admission, from officers who had previously dismissed Allied innovation as inferior to German engineering, represented a fundamental shift in military thinking about the relationship between fortification and assault technology. The legacy of the AVRE extended far beyond World War II, influencing military engineering doctrine through the Cold War and into the modern era, with every major military developing specialized vehicles capable of defeating fortified positions, from the Soviet IMR engineer vehicles to the Israeli Puma combat engineering vehicle, all incorporating lessons learned from the Churchill tanks that deleted German bunkers. Modern combat engineering still uses many of the same principles developed for the AVRE, including the concept of delivering massive demolition charges from a protected platform, though the technology has evolved from spigot mortars to sophisticated missile systems. The human stories behind these weapons remain the most compelling aspect of their history, from German machine gunners who spent their final moments firing desperately at approaching AVREs they couldn't stop, to British engineers who risked everything to get close enough to use their petard mortars, to Japanese soldiers who faced the choice between burning alive or abandoning positions they had sworn to defend to the death. These individual experiences, preserved in memoirs, unit histories, and interview transcripts, provide a visceral understanding of how technological innovation changed the nature of combat, turning previously safe positions into death traps with the simple addition of a spigot mortar to a Churchill tank. The MG-42 itself survived the war and continued to influence machine gun design for decades, with its basic mechanism copied in weapons like the American M60 and the Belgian FN-MAG, testament to its fundamental soundness as a weapon system. Yet its story also serves as a cautionary tale about over-reliance on any single tactical solution. The German faith in the MG-42's ability to dominate the battlefield had led them to build their entire defensive doctrine around fixed positions that maximized the weapon's effectiveness, creating a critical vulnerability when those positions could be eliminated with a single demolition charge. In the broader context of World War II, the confrontation between the MG-42 and the AVRE represented the collision between traditional military thinking based on firepower and position, and innovative approaches that sought to neutralize enemy advantages through specialized technology, a pattern that would be repeated throughout the conflict. The German military, despite its reputation for innovation and tactical excellence, proved surprisingly conservative in its defensive doctrine, clinging to concepts that had worked in previous conflicts even as evidence mounted that they were obsolete. The final German defensive operations in 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of the Reich, showed that they had learned some lessons from Normandy, with MG-42 positions now dispersed and concealed rather than concentrated in obvious bunkers, but by then it was too late, and the industrial might of the Allies had produced thousands of specialized vehicles that could deal with any defensive configuration. The last Wehrmacht units to surrender in May 1945 included MG-42 crews who had survived the entire war, from the blazing victories of 1940 to the apocalyptic defeats of 1945, witnesses to the complete transformation of warfare that had seen their weapon go from battlefield dominance to irrelevance. The Japanese surrender in August 1945, following the atomic bombings and Soviet invasion of Manchuria, prevented the planned invasion of the home islands where millions of civilians had been trained to resist using bamboo spears and suicide tactics, but military planners had already prepared for this eventuality with massive production of flamethrower tanks and other specialized vehicles that would have turned the invasion into an even greater humanitarian catastrophe. The lessons of Okinawa, where flamethrower tanks had burned out elaborate cave defenses, would have been applied on an unprecedented scale, with some estimates suggesting that specialized armor would have been responsible for the majority of Japanese casualties in the planned invasion. The comparative analysis of German, Japanese, and Italian defensive failures in the face of Allied specialized armor reveals common patterns of overconfidence in fixed fortifications, inability to adapt quickly to new threats, and the psychological collapse that followed the realization that supposedly impregnable positions offered no protection, lessons that military planners continue to study today. The MG-42 crews who died in their bunkers at Normandy, the Japanese machine gunners who burned in their caves at Okinawa, and the Italian soldiers who fled their positions in the Gothic Line all fell victim to the same fundamental error, believing that defensive firepower and fortification could triumph over innovative assault technology. Today, as military forces around the world grapple with new threats from drones, precision-guided munitions, and cyber warfare, the story of how the flying dustbin defeated the MG-42 serves as a reminder that no defensive system is invulnerable, that innovation and adaptation are essential for survival on the modern battlefield, and that the next war will likely be won by whoever develops the equivalent of the AVRE for their generation. The concrete bunkers of Normandy, now tourist attractions and memorial sites, stand as monuments not just to the courage of the soldiers who fought there, but to the power of innovative thinking to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, a lesson as relevant today as it was on June 6, 1944, when the first Churchill AVRE deleted its first MG-42 nest with a flying dustbin.